Welcome to another episode of Build with Bitcoin. We're very excited today to welcome as our guest Bob Burnett. And Bob is the CEO and founder of Barefoot Mining, along with with a number of other ventures that we'll be talking about today. He's one of the people in Bitcoin that I admire the most because Bob has a way of really looking forward and looking ahead at where Bitcoin is going and planning for its growth, planning for potential attack vectors, and really thinking the big pictures of Bitcoin. So as the founder of a company, as investors of companies within the Bitcoin space, we thought there'd be no better guest to welcome to our this episode than Bob Burnett. Bob, welcome.
Thank you, Lynn. Hello, Israel.
Thank you, Bob. So Bob, Lynn touched a little bit about your interesting perspective, which we'll of course be getting into. You've held a role in the Bitcoin space both as an entrepreneur actively and also as an investor. We hope to cover both sides of those aspects during this hour of the episode, but if we can start a little bit more on the entrepreneurial side, that's the direction we'd like to take here. But prior to that, for our listeners' context as well, you come from a technology background. You were a director at a Fortune 100 company. Can you explain what got you into the Bitcoin industry and a little bit more of your skill sets prior to this?
Sure. So those of you who are watching, you can tell I'm a little older. I've been around a long time. And to date myself, I was on a design team for what I would believe to be the world's first laptop in the 80s. And very junior member, that I don't want to overstate my role, but I was there, part of that. And what that did was it brought me into the personal computer industry at its infancy. And it was a very privileged position. There was a lot of luck involved in being in the right place at the right time. But what it allowed me to do was grow personally in parallel with this industry that was maturing. And so I spent 6 years with a company called Zenith, working. They were a Fortune 500 company. At the time, one of the bigger TV brands in America, but also had a personal computer division. Were pioneers in the early days of the personal computer. I left. We're going to talk some about startups and entrepreneurship. So when I was 27 years old, I had been there for 6 years. I had a vision, along with a couple other guys, for the way that the laptop market was going to evolve, which may sound obvious now, but at the time wasn't. And that was, we believed that laptops were going to get very small and very light and very portable. But the prevailing attitude was these bigger, clunky machines, and most of the personal computer products, instead of trying to drive functionality into the products, right? And so, which was expensive, right? So we were taking this vector of, we believe that people will pay more for more functionality instead of wanting the same thing, but for a cheaper price. And so we did a startup for that. We were fortunate, me and the two other key founders, we're fortunate. We raised about $15 million from Mitsui and Sanyo. This was in 1991. And with this vision of creating this laptop, which our goal at the time was 1 kilogram for the US-based people, that's 2.2 pounds. Could we build a product that was 2.2 pounds and ran at the time Windows? So again, things that probably don't sound very fancy in terms of technological achievement, but for the time, we're really pushing the envelope. And we were fortunate enough to complete that design. And then we were faced with the problem that a lot of companies face. I guess you could look at it as a problem, or you could look at it as an opportunity. We had to decide, are we going to bring this product to market ourselves, which meant building a sales team, a customer support team, a service division, a logistics team, like all that sort of stuff? Or do we get somebody to white label the product? And we chose the latter path in part just because of simplicity, right? So we started shopping it to all the big personal computer brands at the time. And by the way, got a lot of doors slammed in our face. It was a very, because the prevailing attitude at the time was the same one I told you about. The marketing departments and the focus group studies were telling everybody to build cheaper laptops, not build more expensive, smaller, more portable ones. So fortunately, we found one company, which was an up-and-coming personal computer company called Gateway, which was led by a guy named Ted Waite, who part of the story is I'm gonna end up telling you that basically they bought our company as I'm getting a little verbose here, but they ended up buying the company instead of just buying the product. They basically bought the company. I joined Gateway. They put me in charge of developing the laptop division of Gateway, which they didn't have one at that time. This was their first entry into that market. And through that, thank you again to Ted, because Ted Waite, who is the founder and CEO there, he had a little bit of a jobs like vision, and hopefully to some degree I did as well, and that he was willing to be the contrarian, to go not with what the market focus groups said, because with technology, it's one of the things you find is that usually the focus groups and the general public is wrong about technology, and that there's a certain group of people. I'll let the world judge how much of one of those people I am, but I try to be a technologist and say how will society react to this technology? How will it impact society, and build things that they don't know that they want yet. Like that's really where opportunity lies. Like it's easy to build something that somebody tells you they want. What it's hard to do is build something they don't know they want yet. So we had done that. Long story short, I've already made it a long story. So, but I ended up turning that into $1 billion division within Gateway. Was part of the team that took Gateway public.
And this was
became the CTO there.
This was mid-90s.
Early into mid-90s. And I ended up staying at Gateway till 2004. We reached, we were actually in the Fortune 200. We didn't reach the Fortune 100, but we had 25,000 employees, 10 billion a year in annual revenue, over $1 billion in profit. We were one of the top 10 most recognizable brands in America in the 90s. Our cow-spotted boxes were ubiquitous across, especially North America, but to a certain degree in Europe. And so our brand stood with brands like Coca-Cola and IBM and like these iconic brands. And then I left there in the mid 2000s. I guess probably a little bit of burnout, a little bit of and there's some dispute as to whether or not I got fired or whether I quit, because there had been a management change, and the new CEO and I didn't see eye to eye. In summary, I would say he was more of a focus group guy, and so we did not see eye to eye about where technology should be moving and how the company should be going. So I say I quit. He would probably tell you I was fired, but that's okay. By the way, those out there, don't ever be ashamed of saying you got fired. Even if you do, so what? Nobody cares. It's and to a certain degree. I mean, if you got fired because you stole something or you never showed up to work, that's one thing. If you get fired because you believe in a certain direction in something, and your boss or the rest of the management team doesn't agree with you, so what? They can go take a hike and go follow your vision. Go for it.
Yeah, and drawing that parallel, Steve Jobs got fired from his company and then came back and redid it. So it's like the visionary part of it. And so Bob, I mean, maybe that's why, when I listen to you talk about Bitcoin and your perspective on the companies, you always have a very forward thinking, orientation about the technology and where the technology is going in order to accommodate the growth that I think those of us who are big believers in Bitcoin realize it's going to need to take. And you are, I mean, your expertise and your backgrounds in hardware, which is really hard. I mean, having worked with a lot of tech startups myself, we avoided hardware because hardware was hard.
Yeah.
But you're in the hardware aspect of Bitcoin. But circling back to Israel's question, how did you get into Bitcoin, and how did you make that move from leaving Gateway to finding your way into the Bitcoin space?
When I left Gateway, I was looking for that next thing. I started a technology incubator. So we started, I don't know the exact count, 20, 25 companies or something like that through the incubator. Some were my ideas where we would come up with kind of the genesis of the idea and then go try to find leadership to run it and either provide funding or find funding. And then sometimes it would be somebody that had an idea and came to me, and we would, maybe provide some mentorship and some of the administrative structure, like HR and accounting and facilities and that sort of thing. I did that. I struggled, to be honest, though, because I had come from a world where for 20 years, I was at the forefront of technology, very fast-paced. I was driven every day knowing that the things I was working on were world-changing. And I wasn't alone. These were all teams of people. But, we were working on those things. And even when I left, by the way, like, I was working on things like a smartphone not very different from the iPhone that came out a few years later. I had developed MP3 players. Gateway had entered the TV business. We were actually the number one plasma TV brand in America in 2002. That's something probably nobody remembers, but I had designed those products, and that was really cool. So, changing the way people lived and worked and businesses were run or all that. And then when I left Gateway, I wasn't doing that anymore. And that, I'm not saying that the things that I was working on didn't have merit, but it was honestly difficult for me. There was an emotional, psychological thing that was difficult. And I wasn't famous or anything, but like I said, I was in this very fast-paced, very meaningful, my purpose in life was very known and defined. And that was great. And I sometimes say, I think I unknowingly then experienced this letdown that maybe is like a professional athlete when they retire, or maybe like a musician who, maybe was at the top of the charts for 10 years and then now they're not. And, they were selling out arenas and now they're in the, I don't know, some little town in Alabama, they can't sell out a small theater. Like I think I was kind of feeling that same sort of thing. And I'm not saying I was depressed, but it's like, what's my purpose in life? Because when you've done something so impactful, you want to be there again. Like you want to be part of that. And I didn't feel that. So then in 2017, so several years went by, right? Like a decade goes by. And I'm kind of wandering through. We did some cool stuff, but nothing even worthy of me talking about on this show. And then I got a phone call in 2017 from an ex-Gateway person. His name was Bill, from Seattle, Washington. Not Bill Gates, though. Although I spent a lot of time with Bill. I know him. We could talk about that a different time. But he said, hey, Bob, this is Bill. Do you remember me? I did. He said, I'm with a team, and we are building an Ethereum server farm. We need 800 servers as fast as possible. And we can't get anybody that one can get access to the NVIDIA chips that we need in the servers. They need 8 in every server, so they need like 6,400 of, at the time, which was the latest NVIDIA chips. And number 2, we can't get a professional design. Can you do that? So I was wearing kind of my hat as a computer guy, not anything else, right? So I looked very quickly at what was required. Said, yeah, we can certainly design things way better than what's in the market. Because I don't know if you guys would have known, even in the Bitcoin era, but the Bitcoin and the Ethereum people, which were using GPUs at the time, graphics processors, basically video cards, right? What people were doing was they were buying wire racks from Walmart. And because they were difficult to cool, they tried to put a fancy name on it, which was called open frame design, was what they called it, which literally meant like wire metal racks like you would put your shoes on, and they would strap motherboards and graphics cards on there with zip ties and try to get airflow over these things. Like, for one guy putting one in his garage, it might work. You try to put 800 of them in a data center, and it's a disaster. Like, it would be impossible. So, knowing how to design servers and laptops and create airflow and those sort of things, those are the same problems I had been solving for 2 decades. So I said yes. And then fortuitously, a little piece of history, when NVIDIA was a startup company back in the early 90s, the first company to give them a chance and put their product into a system was Gateway. And so we had great contacts. Me and Keith Thomas, who's the president of Barefoot, and was the head of desktop engineering at Gateway, we know the management structure. Jensen was, personally making the sales calls back in those days, calling on us. So we asked for a favor. Can you give us these chips? Because they were in high demand, and they said yes, they would support us. And so boom, we were in the business. And our first order was 800 servers. They were something like $6,800 each. So we started a company overnight based on that order, which the company now is, is Barefoot Mining. So it's a great way to start, right? We're very fortunate that the customer came to us to start the company with like a $6 million order. So that's those people out there starting companies, don't count on that. That's like lucky beyond belief.
Well,
but it got us going.
Experience and relationships too. So it also value.
Yeah. So, but I'll say this, when you go through life, be really nice to people and treat everybody with respect and give them a chance if you possibly can, like within reason. Like, be nice to everybody. And the little company or somebody runs into you at a conference and they want to take 10 minutes to tell you about something, listen to them. Be polite to them, because you never know when that person turns into Jensen, the CEO of NVIDIA, and is now one of the richest men in the world. You never know, right? So I have a lot of those stories. I have a good friend of mine. He's a business partner. He, a lot of times when we're together and he's introducing me to somebody, he'll introduce me, says, Bob, I want to meet you, Joe. And then he'll say, Joe, I want you to meet Bob. Bob knows more billionaires than anybody in the world, like, which is not true. But I do know a lot of billionaires, just because I was in the infancy of this industry. And, my position put me in a place where, whether that's Terry Go at Foxconn or Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer at Microsoft, I was dealing with these people when they had small companies, and in some of them, I was in a position, I gave them the chance, or my company, I don't want to say me, but, me and my position with the authority I had, I gave them a chance. And, they ran with it and they became billionaires. I'm not a billionaire, but anyway, so that got me in. And then there was a path, because I know I'm going long-winded. There was a path from there to, like, hey, will somebody else want to buy these servers? Turned out there were plenty, but most of the people that wanted to buy them didn't have access to energy. So they said, hey, will you host? I'll buy them from you, but only if you host them for me. Like, oh, okay, well, I guess we got to add a new service to our offering, which was hosting. And then we saw that the company was that these machines were making a lot of money for the people that were buying them. So we said, well, why don't we take the profit and put it into our own equipment and start mining for ourselves? So then we became, self-mining. And then after a little bit of time, when I finally was breathing, because basically we had started a new computer company, right, and a hosting company, and I was looking at it strictly through those optics, strictly through a fiat lens, right, and then, but then I started looking at Ethereum more deeper technically, like what is this thing, how does it work? And you're right, Lynn. I do have a background in my career was in hardware, but actually my degree is in computer engineering, and I did things like operating system design, compiler design, all that sort of stuff. That's my education. And so I know about at least the basics of software architectures and those sort of things. And I was looking at Ethereum going, this thing is amazingly complex. I saw the centralization. I saw that they were trying to move off of proof of work to proof of stake, and I didn't like it. It all smelled wrong to me. So I started digging that the insufficiencies and warts of Ethereum led me to Bitcoin. Then I saw Bitcoin, then we pivoted the company. Instead of doing Ethereum based stuff, we switched to Bitcoin stuff about a year later. And here we are.
Bob, it seems like so many people that I run into that are in the Ethereum or other blockchain world, they have this impression, or they're told that it's because Bitcoin is deficient and they're fixing the problems of Bitcoin, whether it's speed or scaling. But you, with your technical background, both in software design and hardware, being able to see how the mining supported the security of the system, you went the opposite direction. So you really saw the deficiencies and complexities of Ethereum and appreciated more the simplicity and of Bitcoin.
Yeah, well, I'm actually glad you used that term, because I think there is, when you're an engineer, and you're designing a product, I don't care whether that's hardware or software, whatever it is you're designing, you should be attempting the simplest path to meet the end goal, right? And there are other factors, reliability and consistency and like those sort of things. But at the end of the day, you want it, whatever it is you want it to accomplish, you want it to do the simplest thing. The more that you ask one product or service to become multiple things, like I just so happen, like here's a Swiss Army knife, right? Well, this happens to be a pretty small one, right? It's got I think it's got it's got a scissors and a knife and like a screwdriver thing. Like it's very simple. But they're also like those Swiss Army knives that are like massive, right? And I never buy those kind. They're so overkill. And maybe there's somebody out there that would prefer that, but to me it's over engineered. And I think the Ethereum people got caught up in the technology of what they could theoretically do and forgot what it was they were trying to solve. And so, in fact, I'm not sure they ever even knew exactly what it was they were trying to solve. If you look at the mission statement, it was, oh, we're going to be the world computer. Oh, we're going to be the smart contract DeFi platform. Oh, we're going to be the NFTs things. Now, they're kind of, if I were to summarize my impression of it, now it's kind of back to, oh, we're going to be an alternative to money, and we're going to be the platform of in other words, they've gone full circle. They don't have an identity. And I think the beauty of Bitcoin is that simplicity. The other thing about Bitcoin, which you guys may know, but what Satoshi did is really, really cool in that anytime you design a blockchain or frankly a network, this applies to networks too, you have this trilemma. And the trilemma is that there are three factors: scalability, or how much throughput you have, security, and decentralization. And the blockchain trilemma, but it's basically the network trilemma, is the same thing, is you can't solve for all three. One is always going to be deficient. Well, the world, almost on everything, it doesn't matter what network you want to talk about. If you want to talk about a cell phone network, or you want to talk about Ethereum, or you want to talk about, whatever, the actual design usually comes down to, we will sacrifice decentralization because you could never sacrifice security in reality, right? Nobody's going to make the decentralized fast thing that's unsecure. That so you end up, or all these systems end up defaulting to, well, we'll live with being centralized and we'll accomplish these other things. Satoshi, I think because he was a one-man crew, and it goes back to a certain degree to what I talked about before. No focus group study is going to tell you to design for decentralization and security and forego scalability at the base layer. Like, nobody's going to tell you to do that. Satoshi had a vision, he implemented it, and he will sacrifice nothing for it. So well, first him, but now I think us, the collective consciousness, the plebs of the Bitcoin community, understand how fundamental that is to Bitcoin being a new global monetary system. That if we sacrifice that, even in the smallest bit, that we jeopardize the whole thing. It's even worse than jeopardize. It's over, right? We jeopardize that, it's over. So people that come into this from with a technology lens, I think kind of look at the wrong place. They look at the base layer, and the base layer, kind of the core mechanism of Bitcoin, is purposely meant to not change very much. So we have a group of people who say, oh, that's its downfall. You're going to get out-engineered by these other blockchains. And my rebuttal would be, no, what we're going to do is we have a base layer that will evolve very, very slowly, painfully slow. But that is maybe its greatest attribute. However, we allow layers, and the innovation can occur at higher layers. I can no longer keep up with all of the layer 2 and layer 3 creations within Bitcoin. It's too much for, I think, any one person to keep up with, especially somebody whose life is to live at the base layer. Like, I don't have time to go up and, kind of poke my head out of the hole and go see what's going on up there very often. So, because I view, my role as somewhat of one of the guardians of this base layer. And so as I see threats to that, if I see people trying to do things, I'm not 100% opposed to change, don't get me wrong, that change can occur, but it has to occur on a slow basis. It has to be a specific reason for it. And probably that reason, it has to be that it makes things better for people at the upper layers. And it does nothing to impact the security or the decentralization. So that's how I look at it. So Bitcoin is rife with, inside the ecosystem, with opportunities for innovation. It's just not at the base layer.
And with everything you just mentioned, Bob, out of curiosity, were you a bit skeptical at first of Bitcoin's design? I mean, you probably hadn't run into a successful decentralization model before, right? So
Yeah.
what were your initial thoughts or impressions when you were studying from an architecture or design perspective the Bitcoin network?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I can't say I got it right away. I had some of the same questions that I think are asked by a lot of people. But as I asked those questions, I consume a lot of content. I read a lot. I was fortunate enough to like stumble across, for instance, like some of the writings of Hal Finney, and was able to say like, hey, for those of you who aren't familiar, Hal was a very prominent person in the Bitcoin ecosystem. Well, he was the second person to enter the Bitcoin ecosystem, the first person outside of Satoshi to run a node and start mining. And he kind of flushed some of that out for me, because he in those, if you look at the early writings, you'll see a lot of the bulletin board postings where all the stuff that people criticize Bitcoin for, people were voicing those concerns in 2010. And some real smart people presented those questions and then answered those questions. And so I think those that take the time to go through that and read it can get it. Maybe you don't want to go back to read the old stuff, but I think part of what I'm trying to do, and there are several others, there are some great people within the community, is hopefully shortcut for some of the people some of this. And so if people have those questions, hopefully people like me, and like I said, there's several other real qualified and nice people that are willing to take time to answer questions. But I get that a lot. Like I answer a lot of DMs on Twitter or comments on Twitter, and I do my best with the time I have to respond to that. And I think that's a great thing about the Bitcoin community, is I think its openness to help people along. That said, there are a lot of shysters out there. There are a lot of things that happen where, and that's one of the things that worries me for Bitcoin, is there are people that are I'm not saying worship Bitcoin, but there are a lot of false prophets, and there are Judases. There are people out there who have technical proficiency, who can take somebody who's naive, doesn't have a lot of technical credentials, and kind of talk them into something that isn't right. It's probably not the purpose of this to take you down that path. But I would just say, if you get involved with Bitcoin, and I highly encourage people, if you have an entrepreneurial spirit, you have technical capabilities, find your way into the Bitcoin community. If you're a developer, wonderful. There's lots of opportunities. But if you're a marketing person, you're a finance person, you're a whatever, there's a place in this space for you. And it is an opportunity still to this day, very similar to the one that I had in the early days of the personal computer industry. You could be part of something for the next couple decades that changes the world in a profound way. And that doesn't come along very often. And I mean no disrespect to people out there working in other areas, but it's one thing to impact the world. Let's say you work in a grocery store and you stock groceries. Obviously somebody has to do that. That's important. You're helping feed the world. That's great. But if you're a person who also had the opportunity to like move the world to a fair, transparent, borderless monetary system, like the impact you will have on the world is dramatically different. And so if that fire is in you, if you want to be part of that, I would say, I can only say go for it, because I still to this day, when I see anybody open a laptop, for instance, I know that part of my DNA is in that. And that's a pretty cool thing. I've told this story before. I have a patent on so like if you're listening to, so if you have an iPhone and you're or any sort of product, and let's say you're listening to this podcast, okay, and you take your earbud out, somebody wants to talk to you or whatever, and the stream stops, and then you put it back in and it goes again. That's my patent. And I invented that. And I get a kick out of that because I know that like every day there's a couple billion people doing that, and I made their life just a smidge better because I invented that particular thing. That's not world changing, right? But it, and the reason I'm talking about this is not to glorify myself. I'm not that important, but I'm saying that you have an opportunity if you work in Bitcoin to make that same kind of contribution where, maybe it's a better payment system, maybe it's a new custody solution, but the sort of thing where, you can add your little morsel to that maybe for decades or centuries in the future, that your DNA is part of that ecosystem, and generations and generations are using it. And somebody may say, so what? I want the money. Oh, okay. But I really don't care that much how much money I make beyond a certain level. I care about this sort of stuff.
I really appreciate. We got just a little off the, I think where we were headed, but so important for people to make that distinction between Bitcoin and the other 22,000 digital assets or blockchain related assets out there, and why Bitcoin is so different, and why it's worth taking the time to build. It's why Israel and I, when we were first talking about it, it's like this is the purpose of this podcast is 100% Bitcoin, and just showcasing from a technology perspective what makes it so special and what makes it different than the others. And starting with the decentralization, the only true decentralized, and the security of it. And then what secures it is the mining, and the use of that, which takes us to Barefoot Mining and your company, Bob. And so Barefoot, as you were, through the stories that you told, it didn't start out as a Bitcoin mining company. It started out providing these servers for Ethereum, and you shifted. Can you talk a little bit about Barefoot Mining and how you told the origin story, but where are you today, and what's important and what's different about Barefoot Mining?
Yeah. So we are very different, I think, than certainly any mining company that the general public would know about, because we're maybe in many ways the antithesis of like a public mining company. We're privately held. Everything we do is private. I believe that it's impossible to be a public mining company and exist within the ethos. That's very important to me. So I have this mantra of, protect the mothership at all costs. And if that meant me going bankrupt, so be it, but we will protect the mothership.
And just to be clear, Bob, when you're saying the mothership, you're speaking to Bitcoin the base itself. Layer.
The Bitcoin base layer, yes. So what we do is we believe in doing small things quickly. And so what that also means is typically that when we design sites, they are on the smaller end of the commercial scale. So for those not familiar with mining, big public companies have a tendency to develop very large sites. I call them elephants, that are like 100 megawatts, 200 megawatts, 50 megawatts. These are massive sums of energy concentrated in very small places. They take a long time to develop. They'll take 12 months, 15 months, 18 months, and they'll cost hundreds of millions of dollars. The belief from that side, to be fair to them, is like, hey, they will develop for maximum operational efficiency. And by consolidating all this stuff into one place, they believe they get that. I believe in something very different. My belief is, hey, while you're building this one monstrosity site, I'm going to build a whole bunch of small ones. And I'm going to have them all over the place so that I have diversity in where my hash power is, so that if a jurisdictional issue comes in, a natural disaster, tax issue, or those sort of things, I have not bet the whole farm, literally the farm, right, on one place. Number one. Number two, I'm going to get a whole bunch of things working before they get theirs working. And if the market conditions change, I can stop. In other words, we might have 2 or 3 projects going at once, but they'll all be done in the next 12 weeks or so. So if we see that, hey, the price of mining equipment skyrocketed, or, there was like I said, a jurisdictional issue, we can either change course or stop or pause or adjust continually based on those conditions. Now, we do sacrifice, theoretically, some operational efficiency. But the other thing is, we don't compete, for the most part, with energy demands from other industries. So one of the problems coming with Bitcoin mining at a large scale is that the power demands of electronic vehicle charging and the artificial intelligence industry are both searching for the same thing now. So 4 years ago, that honestly wasn't the case. They've had this change where at one point, Bitcoin mining was the only group out there looking to consume these large amounts of energy, low-cost energy. Well, now they have to compete with at least 2 other industries that are trying to do the same thing. And they're typically willing to pay more. They have different competitive structures. There are different points in their maturity curve. And so that's what we do. We develop each site as an so Barefoot you could think of Barefoot as an umbrella company. So every site we develop is a unique LLC. So we take an interest at Barefoot in every site, but we bring in outside investors. So it's each site is actually a unique physical entity. And we don't believe in hodling Bitcoin, which is often the strategy of the public miners. For instance, is they're trying to build massive treasuries. What we believe is, hey, the people that have invested with us are the best people to decide what to do with the Bitcoin. So we take the free cash flow of the organization and we give it to the investors every month. So they can decide, do they want it in custody with whomever? Go for it. Do they want to self-custody? Do they want to sell it? Do they want to do whatever? That's not mine for me to say. If they ask for my advice, I'll give it to them, but I don't think that mine is the right place for it. And honestly, not that people shouldn't trust me, but it's dangerous for these large, even a private company like mine. I think it's dangerous for them to hold large honeypots. The likelihood of 6102 type attacks and all that or some version of that, I think, becomes much more likely to be enacted and enforced against an organization like a known private company like mine, and certainly a public.
So by staying private, Bob, you're able to plug into these smaller stranded energy sources and move quickly, right? That's what I'm hearing you say. Can you speak to the footprint of Barefoot Mining so far, as geographically, how many sites you're plugged into? Anything you can share with regards to maybe the energy mix as well?
Yeah, I can so part of it. I'll answer. So, our energy mix, we're about 70% non-fossil fuel sources.
Okay.
So we're very high. We have about a dozen sites scattered throughout the United States. Several of them in South Dakota, one's in South Carolina, but I don't disclose everything. So the only thing I won't tell people is exactly how many sites I have or where they are. How much power we can, or how much power we consume, or how much hash power we consume.
I want to circle back a little bit on something that you said earlier that I think is important to clarify a little bit. You talked about Barefoot. You really believe Barefoot should remain private, and that miners should not be public companies. Yet the names that everyone knows are public miners, and I'd like you to just expand a little bit on that, why you believe that, and then related to it is, then how do how do your investors make money by sharing in the profits of it? And that's why you set up the individual LLCs. I mean, we're really hoping to explore different ways of providing funding support, or the way investors should look at getting involved in an industry where the end goal may not be to be a public company or to be acquired by a public company. So
Yeah,
that's why I really respect your model a lot and want to share what you're doing with a little bit broader of an audience.
sure. Okay, so I have to start with, I've worked in the C-suite of a Fortune 200 company, okay, a public Fortune 200 company, and I was there when we went public, and I managed them through through that whole period. It created a lot of wealth for a lot of people. I'll say that. The capital that came into Gateway at the onset definitely enabled the company to do certain things faster and easier than had it not. That said, it would be my opinion in hindsight that it was a mistake. That the culture of the company, the type of people that were hired, the goals and objectives of the organization all changed, and that was the inflection point. And when you get into that environment, what happens is, and you can't help it. First of all, from a personal motivation standpoint, if you're on the management team or you're one of the executives, it's impossible for you to not care about the stock price. Like, for most people, like for me, and I made a lot of money. I'm grateful for it in one respect, but my net worth, like my salary, became irrelevant. Like I said, I was there pre-IPO, so I did quite well. Like my net worth became all about that stock price. Everything was about my salary didn't even matter. So the way that the market was reacting to our stock became a material part of the way the company started to get managed. And that affected the type of people that got hired, by the way, too. The spirit of innovation and creativity, the counterculture of our company. So Gateway, for those who aren't familiar with it, we were kind of the counterculture company. We're kind of the Bitcoin of the PC industry to a certain degree, in that, if Bitcoin, what Bitcoin is to Wall Street, Gateway was to the rest of the personal computer industry. Like, we were the renegades. We were based in South Dakota. Everybody else was Silicon Valley or Austin, and we're South Dakota. But that started changing. In fact, Israel, you told me earlier you're in San Diego. Well, what happened in 2001? The company headquarters moved from South Dakota to San Diego. Why? Because the feeling was we could no longer hire enough of the pedigree of person that we needed. Now, why did we feel we had to hire a different pedigree of person? We had a company that had grown to 25,000 people, 10 billion in revenue, a billion in profit annually without doing that? Well, there was a group of people who didn't think that was enough, right? That you had to grow. Well, we couldn't count on the core group, at least the perception of the outside, the Wall Street people, the big shareholders, the board complexion changed a little bit, like those sort of things happening. Well, no, you need a guy with this background in marketing or that background in production or whatever. And they better have gone to an Ivy League school. I went to the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee. By the way, I retained my position. I was never threatened until I got fired or quit in 2004. But that kind of attitude was kind of getting through. So I'm talking about this because now you take this to Bitcoin, okay? And so what I'm saying was that the company became beholden to what happened in 90-day cycles, and it became beholden to the perception of Wall Street analysts and large shareholders about what the direction of the company should be. When you go public, that's what you sign up to. Okay, that becomes your master. You are the slave to that. I don't care if you're the CEO and founder, you are the slave to that. And so, if you're making, I don't know, you're making Swiss Army knives, right? Maybe that doesn't matter. When the thing that you're supporting is a movement to replace the global monetary system. And I look at Bitcoin, you guys may have heard me talk about this before. I look at it with a 1,000-year lens. Like, we are trying to change money and give the next 1,000 years of humanity a new monetary system. So if you become a public mining company or a mining company in any shape or form, I believe you are part of the guardianship of the mothership of the base layer. So when you become a public company, now you're infected, though. Your goal and objective is not the long term. Your goal and objective is the 90-day horizons. And I don't care who you are. If you're an executive on that team and you have $30 million of stock options that vest or don't vest based on the performance, or they have a strike price of X that you're about to vest in, or those sort of things, you're human. And by the way, even if you're the Mother Teresa of public company CEOs, the next person won't be. Like, so I'm not in the short term accusing any particular public company of doing anything nefarious. I will accuse Core, which was the largest company, of doing something nefarious, because they went bankrupt through greed and chasing this very thing. But none of the current ones did or have yet, so we'll give them that. But I just don't think it's possible to do that. So I think where you were going with this, Lynn, I think if you're in this startup world, you're creating it, I think you have to say, hey, can I create shareholder value? Can I give a path to recovery of the investment, plus obviously a return on that investment, in a manner that will appeal to them and be fair to them? Now, it may be that certain companies, I would say the higher up you go from the base layer, then probably the less being a public company maybe impacts this. Or maybe I get a little more amiable to it the further up you go. But be very careful, because I have no desire to be the CEO of a public company anymore. Which is funny, because I think at one point that was what I wanted to be, right? I was on this path. I was in a company. I was doing well. I was we didn't have an official ranking system, but I was somewhere between, at one point, number 2 and number 5 in the company of this big company. So if the CEO spot had opened up, I'd at least have gotten a consideration. And there was a point in time where I thought I wanted that, but thank God I didn't. That's what happens a lot in life, right? The things you don't get or that don't happen often are the best things.
And it really kind of takes company building back to kind of the foundational idea where you create a company that has a product or a service that people want, and you earn revenues, and you earn revenues based on the success of that product or service, and you return a certain portion of those revenues, the profits, to the investors. And so instead of a quick fix exit, liquidity event at some point in the future, you're providing an ongoing stream of revenues to your investors based on the profits.
Exactly. I mean, it
Sounds
sounds
like
so
a novel
simple.
concept today.
Yeah,
But
it sounds so simple, right? But, we've gotten so far away from that. And, I'll say this, like the public mining companies have been, for the last 4 years, have been largely very unprofitable, yet they've seen massive growth in their market caps. And the market, interestingly, has rewarded only growth. Like they and I guess to each their own, right? I can't tell shareholders what to do with their money, but I find it kind of sad. I find it, for the Bitcoin world, I think a bit sad because I view it as kind of like I don't know, it's kind of like the worst part of the fiat system infecting something at the core level where, as you said, I'm not telling anybody any news. Go look at the financial statements, the quarterly statements of the public mining companies for the last 4 years. There are almost no profitable quarters from any of them, and most of them have been wildly unprofitable, yet the market caps have continued to grow. So somebody is out there rewarding, in my mind, very poor performance and incenting. I mean, you could call them zombie companies to a certain degree, right? Because they would die without the infusion of capital coming in, because they have no operating profit.
Yeah.
So hopefully that'll shift. I mean, I think everybody's healthier if they get to a point where they're actually operating at a profit, but then they're also valued based on their operating performance, not some speculative future.
Yeah, and it's really interesting hearing you talk about all of this, Bob, and I agree it's sad, but maybe not surprising because they're ultimately operating within the market forces that demand greed and growth at all costs. I mean, maybe that's put a little bluntly, right? But what I want to get to with that is, I mean, I think Bitcoin and sound money in general is solving precisely for that human element of greed and growth at all costs within a monetary system, right? So, you're telling of why you stay private, why you stay true to the philosophy of 1,000-year time frame is likely what also led you to some other projects you're involved with. And I know there's maybe more than we'll be able to cover in this podcast, but can you speak to, with regards to mining, you got involved with ocean mining, the pool side of the ecosystem, and I'm assuming it's partly because you saw some threats within the mining ecosystem, or you're wanting to be constructive to that 1,000-year time frame. Can you speak a little bit to these other projects you've gotten involved with, Bob, and why?
Sure. Okay, so yeah, ocean's probably the most material, at least in the short term, to discuss. But I have a lot of irons in the fire. But it was almost a year ago that, I had for quite a while an ongoing concern that we were seeing a very small number of pools in Bitcoin. And so for those less familiar, so a pool is kind of a collective. You could think of it as a collective where individual miners kind of pool their resources together and work collectively to solve the block. Because when you solve a block, that's when you get paid. You only get paid when blocks get solved. And so if you're a small miner and you're working independently, you can go massive periods of time with getting no payment. And because the reality of the world is that electric bills and payroll has to get made on a much more regular basis, you have to find some mechanism to provide continuity in your cash flow. So pools have that's the purpose of a pool. And they go back really to like 2012 is when the first pools came up in Bitcoin. So they've been around a long time. What's happened though is that the role of the pool has, number one, evolved. So instead of just being this mechanism to share and distribute risk and provide consistent cash flow, they took over also the role of what's called block template creation. So what that means is when a block is getting constructed in Bitcoin, which happens every 10 minutes, if let's say like there is right now, there are 200,000 transactions hoping to get included in a block, we can only include like 4,000 of them. So there has to be some criteria by which 4,000 get picked from the 200,000. And only the people that create block templates get to do that. We've devolved to a world where only the pools do that. And there's 15 pools in the world that do it. There's only 6 of them win 90% of the blocks. So that means that there's a very small percentage of variance between those people picking those transactions. That's how censorship can come into play, right? So part of Bitcoin's value proposition is, hey, we don't see people, we don't everybody is welcome. And so it's a very fundamental tenet of Bitcoin. And I think in terms of being money for 1,000 years, we have to preserve that. To make matters worse, what we're finding out now is that even amongst the 15 pools, several of them are essentially, the pools are then working together and they're using the same template. So we have a really small percentage of differentiation in the blocks. So what happened with Ocean was, so Luke Dasher, who ran a pool starting in 2013 called Allegis through 2017, he started to see this problem. I was seeing it from the miner perspective. He was seeing it from that perspective. Luke has a relationship with Jack Dorsey. He approached Jack Dorsey roughly a year ago with this problem. Jack agreed, saw the same problem, agreed to put $1.5 million of financing in to restart Luke's company and get them going. They needed more money though. And I was the first miner. I don't think I was the first miner they approached, but I was the first. I think they knew some of my perspectives and that I may be more vigilant in my protection of the ethos and those sort of things. So they came to me. When I heard the story, I was super excited because I've been searching for something to break this up. So I have a small fund. We injected just about $700,000 through my fund, by the way, into it as well. Then I committed a decent percentage of Barefoot's hash rate to the pool. This was last summer, so the allowance didn't come into November, but they were able to start the company with not only Jack's money and money from my fund, but then several others. They had some hash rate that we could get started with, including mine and my facility in South Carolina, which is a hydroelectric facility that we own, was where the launch event was held, and that was pretty neat. We had all that crew out there, and then what was kind of neat was I think it was 2 days after the launch when we started going, was one of the servers from my farm that mined the first block for Ocean. So, which was a really cool thing, because even though I'd been mining really since 2018, all of my work was hidden behind the pool. I actually never knew if I won a block or not. I'm sure I did, but I never knew. I never knew it. And I know we're down a little bit of a technical path, but it was very satisfying to know, like, hey, finally, like I can point to a very specific block and say, yeah, my operation made that one. We've had several since, but that was a really cool moment.
And Ocean, you're really the purpose of Ocean is to give more transparency to block template creation, to miners being able to really understand what they're earning and participate in what aligns with their personal belief system. Is that a fair way of saying it?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, thanks for getting me back on track, Lynn. Yeah, so the value proposition of Ocean is, hey, we right now the way we do it is there's 4 templates. So the miner picks which of the 4 templates. The pool selects 4 templates, but you can pick as a miner which of the 4, and they have different decision criteria around those. Very soon what we'll do is we'll change it completely, though, and each miner within the network can create their own. And at that point, the network, instead of maybe having 8 or 10 different block templates that are currently trying to be mined, we could have hundreds. And that's just critical to creating a level of defense against censorship. So even if the big guys go in and start pushing censored templates, meaning like OFAC compliant, for instance, or some exclusion of certain known individuals or known addresses, there will be a group that can fight against that and allow access for everybody. Yeah.
There's so much to be said about Ocean, and I think Israel, I know you and I have talked about this, and Bob, maybe you can help us get Luke and Mechanic from Ocean, and maybe yourself joining them, but to have a separate segment on Ocean and what they're doing, and because I think it also is, from an investor standpoint, it's a great way to get involved in mining and and have that transparency. But just going back to your attraction to Ocean, I mean, that you made a significant investment in the company through your fund. So, I mean, you're a startup, you're an entrepreneur, you're also a fund manager that's investing. So, how did you look at that from a investment perspective, or was it primarily because you saw it filling a need that really aligned with your ethos of protecting the mothership, which I applaud, but from an investment return standpoint, you must have seen value in that as well.
Yeah, I mean, as soon as I'm wearing the fund hat and I have investors, I can't stand on ethos, right? I mean, that's a cherry on top, but the investment has to stand on its own merits. The simple way to look at it is a pool makes its money by taking a percentage of the money that flows through its pool. So if each year there are about 53,000 blocks processed. So just to do some quick math, if at some point Ocean could achieve, let's say, roughly 10% of the world's hash rate was through the pool, then that would be 5,000 blocks roughly would flow through that. And if the pool had a 2% fee rate, which is pretty typical, the pool would, what is that? 2% of 5,000 is 100 blocks, right? All right. Yeah, 100 blocks. So, it can, that's just a guesstimate of the kind of revenue that would be possible. So if each block, if we were in a world with 3 1/8 was the subsidy, and let's just make the math simple, let's say they were four in total with fees. So now we have 400 Bitcoin a year. as the income stream of the company. So the company can make a Bitcoin, a little over a Bitcoin a day on the top line. And as a software company, there's not a lot. It's not a big company, right? It's a couple guys and women. There's some women in it too, but it's a small overhead company. So it really comes down to how much of the global hash rate can we capture. And we don't want to capture all of it. We don't want to have 50% of it. We'd like to have a healthy number, like between 10 and 20. And I'll let you guys decide what one Bitcoin is worth if you want to put it in fiat terms. But as a Bitcoin company, it's a company that can produce over 1 Bitcoin a day of revenue without a big stretch. And and it can do that theoretically for a long time, right? So, that's its potential.
One of we could talk for hours, I'm sure, but one of the topics that you've been really speaking a lot about, that you really educated and opened my mind to, is the importance of, or the coming scarcity of block space, and also, more importantly, the scarcity of hash rate, and how in the future you see that financial services companies will be wanting hash rate in order to process their transactions. So as Bitcoin becomes more important in the global financial system, ETFs being one way, if you want your transactions processed, given the scarcity that you just talked about, can you dive into that just a little bit and clarify that for our listeners? Because I think, if you're in traditional block templates are important, but it will be in the future. And I think this is a learning curve that many people will be going through.
We already talked, there's I guess, trust me on the math, but a block gets processed every 10 minutes, right? Give or take a little bit. It's actually about 9 minutes and 49 seconds is the average. Okay. Extrapolate that out to a year. We'll keep the math really simple. A little over 50,000. It's like 53, but the math will be easier at 50, right? Each block has a finite size. It's called 4 million weight units, but an easy way to think about it is it's about 4,000 transactions. Okay, so if you have 4,000 transactions per block, 50,000 blocks a year, that's 200 million. So it's my belief, some people disagree with me, it's my belief that number is highly unlikely to change, that we can't change the size and we can't change the speed, and that minor things we could do technically to get more transactions in won't have a material effect. Okay, so if we take that 200 million then, say, well, that's the capacity of the network. And the thing about Bitcoin is it doesn't matter whether each transaction is carrying $1 billion of value or $10 of value. That's the capacity, right? Now, given that there's no way to increase that capacity, we have to look at how do you get access to it? What is the cost of that access? Well, we live in a world today where for the past 15 years, that block space has largely been unfilled, meaning each block for the most part was not full. And therefore, when people wanted access to it, they could get it for free, close to free, whenever they wanted. We saw 2023 be a year in which that started to change. In 2023, the blocks were almost 100% full from January to December, the whole year. We had periods of time where the demand spiked and the fees went up, not a little bit, but by orders of magnitude very, very quickly. And that's an indication of what happens when something is scarce. So when something is scarce, I give this example of an apple tree. I say, pretend I have the only apple tree in the world, and it produces 100 apples per day. Now, if we are at a point in time where only 95 people want an apple every day, then they're not very expensive. Right? We're throwing 5 apples away a day. But the moment 101 people want apples, we have a problem, right? The price starts going up, and not a little bit. Just the demand change of 6 apples per day has a dramatic effect. When 120 people want apples, when 150 people want apples, when 200 people want apples, you have a problem. And the tree's still producing 100. There's nothing you can do. And that's part of Bitcoin. So not only is, Bitcoin itself absolutely scarce, the 21 million, but the block space in any time window is also scarce. So we have the second example, interestingly, where we have a commodity. So I think you should think of block space and access to that as a commodity. The commodity cannot there's the typical like supply reaction, the elasticity and the price curves and all that, they break, right? Because so what it results in is fees going up massively. And so I believe the Bitcoin network now sits at that range where on good days, at least for the network, we only have demand for 95 apples. On bad days, we see 101 or 102. This is with well under 1% of the world adopting Bitcoin. This is with essentially at the individual level. There's 8 billion people. We maybe have 10 to 40 million active users. We have, of the 330 million companies in the world, we essentially have 0 that are active. So this base layer, this access to this 200 million is going to become so precious. Now, if you're a financial services company and you start seeing Bitcoin becoming more and more important to your business, if you don't get access to the base layer, you're not in business, right? Like you got to fight for the 200 million. So it's my belief, a lot of people believe there's this imminent merge of the mining industry with the energy industry. And there are synergies. I'm not saying there aren't. But I don't believe it's an existential issue to the energy companies that they be involved in mining. It's an opportunity. They have some efficiencies. There's some things. But on the financial services side, if they don't have a guaranteed mechanism where they can get access to the base layer, it may be existential. They are locked out. Like especially if their fiat line of business goes away. And there are companies, I'll use Swan as an example. If you're Swan and Swan Bitcoin is a company, for those who aren't familiar with that, you can buy Bitcoin from Swan, and part of their value proposition is you can withdraw your Bitcoin from Swan for free into self-custody. So it's a nice feature. Well, if Swan just has 4,000 people a day that want to do that, in a world of 8 billion people, if they have 4,000 people a day that want to make a withdrawal, they have to win 1 block a day. There's only 144 to 150 a day. They have to win 1 block a day just to do that, or their business model goes away. So I'm not saying this from an insider perspective, although I know the Swan folks well, but they are now involved in mining. So you might say, well, why are they involved in mining? Well, whether they did it this way or not, they made a brilliant move because now they have secured a mechanism for their business, right? So they may make money at mining. They probably are. They should be. They're good guys. I like them. But they've also secured their future. So there's, like I said, there's a 50,000 blocks a year. There's let's call it 150 a day. If you're BlackRock, if you're Fidelity, if you're a financial services company, if you're a bank providing custody functions globally, remember this is global too. We're sharing this all globally. Then, I think like I said, I believe it presents an existential issue to the financial services companies, but it provides a massive opportunities to those who come in first. And so, the only way for them to be certain that they get that is to control a miner and control a block template.
And By the way, you mentioned the likes of, some of these larger asset managers, and Fidelity, if I'm not mistaken, has tested out the mining space for quite a few
Yes,
years.
correct.
Do you see those bigger players also in the near future getting more involved, Bob?
In one way or another. I mean, it may be by coming to a public company or a private company and saying, well, we want to contract with you that we'll pay you for guaranteed access. That's possible. In fact, one of my side projects is a marketplace to sell futures to this. So if I'm so just as an example, because what you have to do, I think the way to look at this is, I mentioned this before, if you look at block space as a commodity, now also wear the hat of a miner. Miners historically have gotten almost all their revenue from the block subsidy. So the miners, when they win a block, they get a reward, which is a subsidy plus fees. Historically, almost all that money was subsidy. Well, I'm predicting, others feel differently, but I am predicting that within 5 years, roughly 2/3 of miner revenue will come from fees, not subsidy. Now, the fees are variable. The subsidy's always been fixed. So that makes the miner revenue as measured in Bitcoin highly variable. So how do they moderate that and steady it out? Well, if I'm a miner, I own 1% of the global hash rate, and let's say it's here, call it May 1st, right? If it's May 1st, and I want to sell access to 1,000 Bitcoin transactions in October, that would be appealing. If I could lock in and know that I can sell those at a fixed price, that that I can live with, right? So I offer a 1,000 unit contract for October. And on the other side of that, there will be companies and individuals that say, well, I know I have to do a lot of on-chain activity in October. Let me lock it in, and as we get to that price may float up or down, right? And so you'll have speculators who trade these as well. But it's just like a commodity. It's no different than a farmer. The farmers in the Midwest right now are planting corn, right? So, if a whole bunch of them are, as they're planting the corn, they're already out selling future contracts. They're maybe selling 20% of their October production at a price that they know they're comfortable with. And they'll let a little of it ride. And, then as they get closer, they may sell it off. By the time they get to October, they've probably sold futures contracts for most of the actual harvest. I think Bitcoin miners will be the same way.
The first time I heard you talk about this, in side project, it sounds like just a phenomenal marketplace that has so much potential. I mean, is this a part of Barefoot, or is this standalone, or do you have a timing projection on when it'll be available?
Yeah. So I've had this vision for quite a while, for a year and a half. About a year ago, I started working with a company out of Tampa called Block Spaces. And they're a Lightning development company. And so we've actively been developing the platform. So, I had the vision for this. I've worked with them on the architecture. They're doing the implementation. We've got a whole bunch of it already done. We're not ready to launch yet, but I would say you'll see it here. Well, you'll see it this year. I don't want to throw a date out there and set an expectation that maybe doesn't get met, because there's a lot of testing that has to get done. But we're at a beta stage where we're running trials on certain contracts and already.
Well, we'll have to have you back to talk about.
Yeah, it's a whole rabbit hole there. And by the way, we'll have other futures products that run on the same platform, not just block space. But I think there's, in the mining industry, there's a lot of people who have been promoting hash price derivatives or hash rate derivatives and those sort of things. And God bless them. I mean, anybody can do that and they can go out. But the problem with those, in my opinion, is that while they solve a problem for the miners, they don't solve a problem for somebody on the other side. The beauty of block space is that the miners need this stability of revenue and certainty of revenue. But on the other side, the financial services companies or users of block space are going to need stability in the cost structure, right? So that creates the appropriate natural market, in my opinion, right? So I believe it's a much more important product than like hash price or hash rate derivatives. By the way, it's an example because I know you're focused a lot on entrepreneurship. These sort of opportunities, like my big problem is finding time and selecting which projects to work on, because I have so many ideas and so many things I want to get done, because the space presents so much opportunity. There are so many problems to solve. If you come out and you experience Bitcoin, you start using Bitcoin, and then you see problems that you're facing, like, hey, it's too hard to do X, or wouldn't it be cool if I could do Y? That's where the innovation comes. It's by being the first person to ask the question that the real cool stuff happens.
Yeah, well, I mean, on that note, I mean, I think we're ending on a great note with with all of your advice here, Bob. What any other comments or pieces of advice for someone looking to enter the space and maybe a little weary or scared?
Well, I'll go off of what you said. It's natural to be scared, right? I mean, that you have to take that leap of faith. When I'll use my own personal history. When I was 27 years old, I was at Zenith. I had a good job. I was doing well. And I left that job. I had a 1-year-old infant. I took a 40% pay cut or something like that, to start my own company, and it was scary, and you can wait until the stars align properly to when my kids are the right age, or when I lose 20 pounds, or whatever the hell you think in your head would make it a better time to do it. But you got to just do it. Like, as soon as you identify that thing, whatever your thing is, like, you got to go for it. Because if somebody else, somebody else would have invented the world's first laptop, somebody else would have come up with the earbud idea, somebody else would be the privately held company building small mining sites. I'm not so special that I think that nobody else would have had these ideas. The world will fill that gap, and so, I'm reminded of this phrase. It was this story. It was about a poet, and I wish I could remember it, so I'm just paraphrasing it. But it's a little like esoteric, maybe mystical, but the thought was, the poet said, "Hey, the wind blows these words through me, and it is imprudent on me to capture them at the moment they blow through, because if I don't capture it and take action on it, it will keep blowing to somebody else." And so I think it's the same thing with this. I mean, I'm a technologist, so what flows through me are obviously a certain type of things that my frequency is tuned to. But ironically, I don't think it's any different than the artists. If you're a musician or a poet or whatever, these things flow through you, and you can tune them out. You can, and I think that's what most people do, is they go through life and they tune that stuff out, deaf to them. And I think that's sad, because I think everybody probably has this capacity, but they have to tune in, and then they have to be brave and go after it, right? You got to do it. So, Bitcoin is the opportunity of a lifetime. I don't care whether you're 20 or you're 50, like it's not too late. I turned 60 in a few weeks. Like it's not too late. Like, go for it.
Well, I mean, can't thank you enough, Bob. Truly, I don't know then any last comments or questions, but it's an honor to have you on the podcast.
Yeah. I think, Bob, those final words were just kind of resonated and took us home exactly where we need to be. But yeah, I agree, Israel. We could talk to Bob for hours. Bob, I hope you'll consider coming back on the show again in the future, with the marketplace for block space, with ocean mining, with some of the other things. But we just can't thank you enough for your time and for your insights and for sharing all that you know, your wisdom and perception of where things are going, because I think it's so inspiring to the startups and the startup founders and entrepreneurs out there, and helps investors think about things a little bit differently too. So really appreciate all of your contribution to the space and to joining us today.
Well, thank you. Very kind of you to have me on, and happy to come back if you ever feel I'd be of value. So thank you, guys.